When mentioning ancient Egypt, many images come to mind: pyramids, mummies, hieroglyphs, the Nile River, and luxurious cat statues. But this is far from all that is associated with the fantastic and unique period of Egyptian history. In this video, I will talk about the most unusual things that the ancient Egyptians did. Enjoy! You have probably heard about how the ancient Egyptians revered cats, but did you know that they also had a great respect for baboons? For them, these were real animal police officers. Apparently, Egyptian authorities kept baboons on leashes and released them on criminals when necessary. Among classical hieroglyphs and artworks, including a fragment titled Old Kingdom of the 5th Dynasty around 2300 BC, baboons are depicted apprehending thieves and other criminals by biting them or holding them by the leg. Besides helping the police, these animals were also trained to gather fruits, brew beer, and dance. They were so revered in Egyptian culture that tattoos of them were found on the bodies of some mummies. While archaeologists have found mummified human bodies in Egypt, they have also discovered the remains of crocodiles. These mummies were preserved but not always in the same way as humans. For example, in 2019, during the excavation of an untouched tomb in the Kubbat El Hawa necropolis on the west bank of the Nile, 10 reptiles were found mummified without the use of resin, which is crucial in the mummification process. However, finding well-preserved mummified crocodiles is not uncommon for researchers. It is believed that ancient people made sacred offerings of these animals, using them as a kind of food for the inhabitants of the afterlife or for the reincarnation of specific deities. In particular, crocodiles were associated with the god of water and the flooding of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians did not ignore the issue of fresh breath. They ground ox horns, ash, and burned eggshells into powder with pumice. This powder was then applied to the teeth and gums to protect against hygienic problems. This method was considered quite effective, at least for mechanical cleaning. However, in terms of overall health, it was probably not the best, as it caused significant gum bleeding. At various times, Egyptians also used a mixture of pepper, iris flowers, and stone resin for tooth cleaning. Notably, these people were among the first to invent toothbrushes, or chewing sticks, as they were then called. They made these tools from branches, using one end as a toothpick and the other as a toothbrush. Members of this civilization also developed their version of mint lozenges from a mixture of boiled herbs and spices such as frankincense or cinnamon mixed with honey, which could be chewed or sucked. You probably guessed that we would return to cats in this video. The Egyptians' love for these animals was no joke. They believed that cats brought good luck to their owners and thus treated them with special reverence. Moreover, they loved their cats so much that when an animal died, all family members shaved their eyebrows to mourn its death and continued to grieve until their eyebrows grew back. The ancient Egyptians, particularly Cleopatra, bathed in sour milk, usually donkey milk, to improve the appearance and condition of their skin. Today, we know that sour milk contains lactic acid, which is a natural alpha-hydroxy acid. Such acids exfoliate the skin surface so that new, more evenly pigmented cells can form and take their place. In Cleopatra's case, it is said that she needed 7,000 donkeys simultaneously to ensure a sufficient amount of milk for her daily baths. At least she didn't let it go to waste. As mentioned, the ancient Egyptians were quite intelligent and resourceful. But their method of healing wounds with moldy bread might seem a bit strange. However, it was actually effective and was a precursor to penicillin and other antibiotics used today. This method worked because the mold on the bread was usually a fungus that produced certain chemicals that killed or suppressed the bacteria around a cut or scratch. Hatshepsut was an Egyptian female pharaoh during the 18th dynasty. The only problem was that she was a woman, and female pharaohs, of which there were only 3, were not as respected as their male counterparts. Ancient Egypt was generally known for its gender equality, but why this didn't extend to their rulers remains an open question. In any case, Hatshepsut decided to take matters into her own hands and wore a long, ancient Egyptian-style beard to appear more masculine. Some artworks depicting her often include this false beard. It seems that people believed in the healing powers of mouse bones for children. For instance, it was said that to cure a sick infant, its mother would eat a mouse, and then the bones of that mouse were placed in a small canvas bag, tied with 7 knots, and hung around the child's neck as a talisman. There is also a suggestion that people from lower social classes used this method to treat children with problems like bedwetting. Canopic jars were vessels used to store and preserve the internal organs of a deceased person during mummification, and then they were kept together with the body. Each jar stored a separate organ. The first held the lungs, the second the liver, the third the intestines, and the fourth the stomach. The heart was considered the seat of the soul and thus remained in the body. Initially, these jars were simple and unadorned, but over time they became more elaborate and eventually represented the 4 deities known as the 4 sons of Horus. Hapi, with the head of a baboon, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, with the head of a jackal, guarded the stomach. Imsidi, with the head of a human, guarded the liver. And Kabesanuf, with the head of a falcon, guarded the intestines. If the legend is true, Pharaoh Pepi II holds the record for the longest reign in ancient Egypt, ruling for 9 decades. He ascended to the throne at the age of 6 and lived until his mid-90s, ruling Egypt during the 6th dynasty. However, many modern Egyptologists dispute this fact and believe that Pepi II ruled for about 64 years. If true, Pepi II would be the second longest reigning pharaoh after Ramses the Great, who ruled for over 66 years during the 19th dynasty. Today, tattoos are not considered unusual, so their culture in ancient Egypt is often overlooked. Archaeologists have not only found tattooed mummies dating back to the 11th dynasty, but also images of living women with tattoos in the form of dots and swirls on their lower chest, abdomen, and thighs. Many historians believe that these markings, due to their placement, were associated with requests for protection and blessings from the gods during pregnancy. It is thought that only women of high status had tattoos. Over time, tattoo designs became more detailed and often resembled depictions of deities to pay homage to a god or goddess. The tattooing process itself was also significant. It was considered a ritual and began with the creation of a flat brush for applying the tattoo. This brush was made from an odd number of needles, usually 3, 7, or 9, with the Egyptians attributing meaning to each of these numbers. Once the brush was made, it was dipped in charcoal, soot, or indigo powder and then repeatedly pricked into the skin. Soot and indigo have antiseptic properties that helped prevent infection. After the tattooing was finished, it was rubbed with various herbs and oils to aid healing and set the pigments. As previously mentioned in the context of baboons making beer, the ancient Egyptians were very fond of this beverage and used it along with bread as currency among traders. It was believed that beer and bread played a central role in offerings to gods and deceased ancestors. In fact, it is thought that soldiers and the approximately 10,000 workers who built the pyramids were paid with beer and bread. The Egyptians valued these so much that they believed it was a sign of the gods' displeasure when the Nile flooded and they couldn't grow enough crops to produce sufficient beer and bread for the masses. The ancient Egyptians built toilets in the tombs of the deceased out of respect, as they believed that the dead were still alive but in another world. Therefore, essentials like food, water, and bathrooms were needed in the afterlife. The pharaoh's hair was considered sacred and was never to be seen. Rulers always wore a crown or headgear called a nemes. These specific fashion statements separated the pharaohs from common people, who were not allowed to wear headgear. King Tut specifically wore sandals with the faces of his enemies drawn on the soles so that he could trample them as he walked. His tomb contained at least 80 pairs of shoes, and on at least one pair, the inside sole of one shoe depicted an African prisoner and the other an Asian prisoner. These individuals represented the enemies of King Tut's kingdom. Hieroglyphs, though consisting of about 2,000 symbols, contained only consonants and no vowels. Therefore, we will never know how the Egyptians pronounced their words in ancient times. However, it is believed that an equivalent of the letter E was sometimes included in hieroglyphs. Additionally, hieroglyphs are considered one of the oldest writing systems in human history. Currently, the scarab family includes over 30,000 species of beetles worldwide, often called scarabs or scarab beetles. The ancient Egyptians believed that the scarab had powerful regenerative abilities. It was thought that the small beetle's journey mirrored the path of the sun. As the sun traveled across the sky, emitting light and warmth, the scarab rolled its dung ball with eggs from east to west until the larvae hatched. The symbol of these insects can be seen in art and jewelry. The scarab is also associated with the gods Khepri, god of the rising sun, Atum, god of the setting sun, and Ra, god representing the sun. This example is quite simple. The ancient Egyptians made fly swatters from giraffe tails. These were not only functional but also considered extremely fashionable. The functionality of these fly swatters is logical since giraffes, like many other animals, use their tails to keep insects away from their bodies. We have already mentioned that the ancient Egyptians loved cats and baboons, but they also kept other animals as pets, including hawks, ibises, long-legged marsh birds, lions, gazelles, and monkeys. Alongside cats, they also had domesticated dogs, which are still common pets today. Although in ancient times, dogs were primarily considered helpers in hunting and guarding, modern people still use dogs for these purposes. In the early days of ancient Egypt, the bodies of a pharaoh's servants were buried with their deceased leader. However, over time, pharaohs were buried with hundreds of miniature models of their servants. These statuettes, called ushabtis, were kept with the pharaoh to perform tasks that the pharaoh didn't want to do in the afterlife. The figures also appeared mummified, which makes sense since they were also going to the afterlife. The models were created for various tasks, such as tiny soldiers, farmers, cooks, brewers, fishermen, and boatmen, found with appropriate tools needed for their specific jobs. Inside each tomb was a magical spell to activate the magical figures, specifically spell number 6 from the Book of the Dead, which read, "If the deceased is called to perform any work that must be done in the realm of the dead, to cultivate fields, to irrigate land, and to carry sand from east to west, do it for him." The ancient Egyptians believed that the Nile flooded every year because of the tears of the goddess Isis, which she shed for her murdered husband Osiris. It was thought that she cried in mourning and also in an attempt to reunite his body. During the flood, Egyptians celebrated the Night of Tears, sailing down the river on colorful boats, singing to their gods, and offering gifts to the river. This festival is still celebrated today, though it is more of a tribute to Egypt's cultural past. Some historians believe that in ancient Egypt, people, especially men, used loincloths as a way to prevent the spread of diseases during intimate relations. Hieroglyphs also show that men wore thin cloth to protect the lower parts of their bodies from the sun and tropical diseases during battles and to ward off evil spirits. It is also believed that they dyed the fabrics in various colors to make them more attractive and enticing. This practice is also seen as worship of the god of reproduction and fertility. Cleopatra is an excellent example of this practice. It is believed that her parents were brother and sister, and she herself married both of her brothers at different times. Although these marriages did not produce children, they were often done to maintain a pure bloodline. It was believed that Isis and Osiris, who were mentioned earlier, were brother and sister who married each other to maintain their family's power. If you look at the genealogies of the pharaohs, you will see many marriages between brothers and sisters, even between parents and children. Of course, as we know today, this usually results in offspring with severe abnormalities. For example, King Tut had a congenital foot defect that caused mobility issues and a speech disorder due to a cleft palate. Other pharaohs were found to have other developmental defects, such as Froelich syndrome, caused by extensive inbreeding in royal families. This tradition continued until the last native Egyptian pharaohs came to power. Pepi II, whom we have already mentioned, was known as a particularly demanding ruler. Perhaps this was because he became a pharaoh at a very young age. Whatever the reason, he clearly felt particularly privileged, possibly even more than other pharaohs. He hated flies and required his servants to be coated in honey. This helped to distract the insects away from him. Pepi II was also known for other unusual actions. Once, he asked Harkhuf, the governor of Aswan and head of an expedition sent to Nubia, to capture a pygmy and bring him to court so he could dance for the ruler. It is worth noting that Pepi II's disdain for flies did not reflect the attitudes of other Egyptians towards these insects. On the contrary, flies were highly respected for their agility and relentless perseverance. Golden flies were even awarded to soldiers who showed exceptional heroism on the battlefield. Let's start with an interesting fact. The invention of mummification is attributed not to the ancient Egyptians but to South Americans. It is believed that in Peru, they practiced this 2,000 years before the first person was mummified in Egypt. Egyptians tried to preserve the body of the deceased so that it could be used in the afterlife. The process was quite complex, and each step had to be precise and well executed. One of the steps involved wrapping the body in cloth over 1.5 kilometers long. It is worth noting that in ancient Egypt, not everyone had the opportunity to become a mummy and go to the afterlife. This was a privilege of the wealthy members of society. After the body of the deceased was dried and wrapped in cloth, it was placed in a sarcophagus made of stone. These were often decorated with carvings or inscriptions, and special items like jars, statuettes, and mummified animals, which we have already mentioned, were placed inside. Share your thoughts in the comments. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Your engagement is the best reward for me. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.